Hello, and welcome to the Things I Want My Daughters to Know podcast, the podcast redefining women's health, one unfiltered conversation at a time. I'm your host, Jacqueline Rose, and every week I'll sit down with leading women's health experts and real women to share their lived experiences, bust health myths, challenge outdated and uninformed narratives, and explore what's really possible for women. We'll talk about periods, fertility, menopause, hormones, aging, and everything in between. This podcast is for every woman who ever felt confused, dismissed, or left out of the conversation about her own health. It is a space to celebrate women, break the silence, and open up conversations between mothers, daughters, sisters, and friends. Please hit the follow or subscribe button so you don't miss an episode and share this podcast with your daughters, family, and friends. Let's get on with the episode.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Things I Want My Daughters to Know podcast. And today, this is a conversation you are definitely going to want to listen to with your daughters, with your nieces, your goddaughters, any woman, young girl that is in your life. Maybe if you're a teacher and you're teaching biology, you may want to share this episode with your students because we're going to be talking about some basic critical things that so many women don't know about. So many young girls are not taught. There are a lot of conversations that happen around between mothers or guardians and daughters around periods, but it's very, very narrow. And I'm so excited today that we have Emma joining us because she is really going to talk about so many things that we as women were never, ever told. So welcome, Emma. Tell us who you are, what you do, and we'll get straight into it.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for having me here. My name's Emma Goff. I am a fertility awareness educator. I'm also a certified miscarriage doula, but I help people track their cycles for family planning and health knowledge. In a super nutshell, that's what I do. But what that looks like on a more practical level, we'll get into a little bit more today. I also host a podcast, the Cyclical Doula podcast. I'm a mom to two, a 6 and a 4-year-old, and my family and my husband and I live in the Charleston, South Carolina area in the U.S. So
Oh,
that's
cool.
just a teeny bit about us.
Yes, amazing. So we're going to get deeper into all of this.
Yeah.
Um, let's start with the most basics. What do young girls, women not know about their cycles? We call it, it's sort of in the vernacular, girls refer to it as their periods. They don't even refer to it
Right.
as their cycle or their menstrual cycle. It's like, I have my period or I don't have my period. That's basically it. And if
Yeah.
you've got a really wonderful mother, she'll make some type of celebration around the fact that you've got your period. And they'll, you go out to the pharmacy and buy some products, but really it revolves around periods, and that's about it. So tell me what you see. What do we know? What don't we know? What do we have to know?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like that's such a big statement too of what don't we know because I feel like there's so many things that I could dive into. But I'll start with
Yeah.
some like super duper basics. When we're talking about a menstrual cycle, I think it's helpful to remember that it's not just the time that you're bleeding. So it's not just your period. So a cycle is its main event is ovulation. And so it's from the time of one bleed until the next. And that not every bleed that takes place means that ovulation has taken place, especially for like adolescents as their bodies are figuring themselves out.
Okay, that's
So
a
I think like
really
that's where we'll
important
start.
point. Yeah,
Yeah.
I really want to delve into that because for me as a menopause educator and coach, we see that as you're getting closer to menopause,
Yes.
that
Yes.
you may ovulate without a bleed, or you may have a bleed without ovulation. So let's sort of firstly talk about the young sort of teens, tweens, young women.
Hmm.
But explain to us, how is that even possible? How are you having a
Yeah.
bleed? So let's sort of delve into that a little bit, and then the maybe some of the assumptions that we have right or wrong. So yeah,
Yeah.
there's
Okay,
so much we
so
have to talk about. I'm so
yeah,
excited.
there is. So I think it's helpful to do like a little bit of an understanding of what of the two main hormones that happen
Yeah.
during a cycle, which I'm sure you've talked about before. But so at the beginning of a cycle, all of our hormones are kind of on the lower end. After our bleed, um, estrogen becomes dominant to be able to prepare our body for ovulation. And then after ovulation, progesterone becomes dominant. And that's like super basic understanding of that. But when there's sometimes in our lives where, um, for a variety of reasons, ovulation is going to be a little bit delayed, a little bit at a different time. We have this assumption that ovulation takes place on cycle day 14 of
Yeah.
every single cycle. That's incorrect. It does happen for some women, but that does is not the case for everybody, especially during menopause, especially during adolescence. That's varies depending upon the specific cycle, depending upon the specific woman. And so um, that that buildup of estrogen can sometimes take place without ovulation happening. So they're like your body's like, ooh, like let's get these follicles ready, like let's try to figure this out, and then you're super sick, or there's a lot of stress going on in your life, or your body is still in adolescence and just trying to figure it out. And so that buildup to ovulation kind of stops or pauses for a little bit. And what we see is then later on, there's another buildup of this ovulate of estrogen for ovulation,
Right.
and that time it like might be successful, and therefore that cycle would be longer in that case. And then on the flip side, sometimes they're shorter, right? So that
Right.
estrogen peaks earlier. Um, and so that's really helpful to know just that time is going to change. And so when we see that for many people, the time after ovulation in their luteal phase when progesterone's high, that stays pretty consistent most of the time. Sometimes there's a little bit of fluctuation in there, especially during like stressful seasons, things like that. But that's kind of helpful to just see what that looks like overall.
Right. Okay. What? So just to understand the biology of it, why would there be a bleed then
Oh,
if
yes. I was like, there was
if
something else
there's
we
a
were talking about. Thank you. So sometimes, thank you. Sometimes we have, estrogen is this there for such an extended period of time,
yeah,
our bodies have what we call sometimes like breakthrough bleeding. So there's this
right,
prolonged estrogen stimulus, and the lining of our uterus, which is what the bleeding is, will just kind of shed a little bit. And so people have what sometimes looks like a period because their body is just like, okay, like let's get rid of this endometrium that's inside our uterus, and then we'll go from there. So yeah, thank you for reminding me what
and
the
that's
beginning
not and
question
that's
was.
and what you've described here is as we know, teen girls and even women,
Yeah.
they may have that regular period, regular menstrual cycle where every, I mean, it's assumed 28 days. We know
Yes.
28 days is an irrelevant number. It could be 32, 36, 27, whatever it is. But sometimes that's longer, sometimes it's shorter,
Yes.
and sometimes the bleed is going to happen without that natural ovulation triggering sort of the estrogen decline and the progesterone increase. Um, and I think I want to just get really specific here because we're
Yeah.
not talking about cases of, for example, PCOS, polycystic ovaries. We're
Yeah.
not talking about cases of endometriosis. We're not talking about cases where there is a reason for that is
Yeah.
known for
Yeah.
irregular cycles. We're talking about just
For
like
sure.
a regular, normal person who has regular cycles. Sometimes they can be a bit off.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that's really important to know, especially for young girls who are in adolescence right after menarche. We say that this adolescence time for women young girls who are like starting their period right away is 6 to 8 years that it takes our body to like really figure out how to
Wow.
regulate our cycle. And so that is that's a huge amount of time. So if a girl's getting her cycle around 12, it might not be until she hits like 20 that she's really her cycle is truly regulated, that her body like really knows how to ovulate well and is in its prime. Obviously, like it's ovulating. There's things happening, all of those
Yeah.
things during that experience, but that's kind of one of the benchmarks that we've seen. And so I think that's really helpful to know just that that time is a little bit there's going to be some cycles that are longer or are shorter. And that doesn't necessarily mean that there's some of these other bigger things like PCOS, endometriosis, all of those things, which if there's markers for those things, look into that
We're heading
for
into a
sure.
different,
But
yeah,
this
we're
is
in a
just
different,
talking about somebody who's like typically cycling.
right. And what about the reverse, or not the reverse, but when women are experiencing very long bleeds? So we know that a bleed is normally between about 3 to 4 days. You can continue having some type of discharge up to about 7 days. But there are some teens, and I was called by a mother whose teen has excessively long bleeding time.
Yeah.
So what's sort of going on there? How do we understand what's going on there?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple parts to it. Ideally, when we see any type of menstrual bleed like that menses, we're looking for a bleed that's 2 to 7 days long. That can include some like really light spotting days.
Yeah.
And we want it to be less than 80 milliliters of blood lost through the whole bleed, which is really a
Wow.
small amount for
Yeah.
many people who experience what they think is heavy bleeds. They're like, "Ooh, like I do that in a day sometimes." So that's a really helpful measurement. And if you're like, Emma, I have no idea how to measure that, there's some tools out there about like how much a specific menstrual product would hold, and you could do some calculations,
Oh,
which can be really helpful. So
cool.
that would be as a parent, I would be like, okay, like let me help my daughter figure out like how much she's bleeding during this time. If she's been spotting for 10 days at a time, that's going to be a slightly different
Sure.
thought process versus if she's bleeding 80 milliliters a day, right, going through multiple pads for
Yeah.
extended periods of time. Like those are two different things.
Yeah.
But the main thing would be to reach out to a medical provider. I think as a general society, we don't do a great job realizing that some of these things are like can be serious or can be supported. So, when there's extended bleeds for a lot of time, to go into a healthcare professional that you will feel supported by. So, to find whomever that is for you and to look into support around that. So sometimes that can mean hormonal imbalances, but especially early on, that can sometimes mean that there's other underlying things going on, PCOS, endometriosis, some pathology even, which is like nothing we ever want to say, but that's true and it's helpful to look into. So,
And
those would
and
all
I
be
think
things
one
we
of
would go
the I
through.
think one of the really important points here to notice is that firstly, again, mothers or caregivers or guardians need to
Yeah.
be asking these questions to their daughters. Don't
Yes.
wait for your daughter to come and tell you I've been bleeding for 7 days. Like
Right.
ask, have these open questions. How is your bleed? Heavy, light? You know, like what are you experiencing? And I
Yeah.
think secondly is that anything that seems a bit off should be checked out. The
Yeah.
problem or the challenge, which I want to sort of maybe push you a little bit on, is that our doctors, unfortunately, don't necessarily take these things seriously. They're like,
Yeah.
oh, fine, it's normal, or come back, the next time this happens, or just take some Advil and, it'll be fine. Um,
Yes.
Often, even if there is good communication between the mothers and the daughters, often they're not getting the answers they really need from their healthcare providers.
Yes.
Um, I know that one of my daughters, who thank God has a pretty regular cycle, there were a few months where she hadn't got a period, she hadn't got a bleed. And so we went to the doctor, and I'm in the field, so I sort of knew what to expect. But it's like, you want to hear them asking the right questions, and sometimes they're
Right.
not. Mostly they're
Yes.
saying, "This is normal. Come back in 3 months' time if it's not right, or let's do some blood work." And obviously, the blood work comes back normal. But you want your doctor to be asking you, what's changed in your life? What is the stress? And we're going to come back onto stress in a minute. If let's say you've got a daughter who's doing exams, there's a very good chance she may miss a couple of bleeds because of the
For sure.
stress.
Yeah.
Is she over exercising? What's going on with her food? What's going on with her sleep? These are questions that you want to expect your doctor to ask you, and very often you don't get that. You
Oh,
get, oh, it's just normal. That's just what happens. As you said, it takes until the age of 20 for your period to settle down. Don't worry about it.
Yeah, absolutely. 1,000%. And I think it's one of those things that's so frustrating. And especially, I know in different countries, different healthcare systems, like you have to see certain providers first or certain things like
Yeah.
that. So I understand that there's additional challenges to that as well. But I think there are some doctors there's that are really working hard to become resources for things like this. Um, it's based out of the US, but their directory is from all over. There's a company called Facts, and they're about fertility education for medical providers is what
Wow.
their goal is. And so that's a really good resource because you can kind of look in there and see if there's anybody in the area that you
Wow.
live in that might have some of this knowledge of okay, like this is how a cycle works, and these are some other things. So if you have the ability to do that, the other thing is just to come in with actual data. So to say, I'm losing this amount of period blood this time and X, Y, and Z, and as much as it's frustrating, being able to, like, especially as a parent, to be able to advocate for your daughter, and being able to be like, no, like, I know that these other questions, like you just said, because those were some really good ones, that those need to be asked. And like that we as individuals sometimes don't have those degrees to be able to have some extra support
Yeah.
or to do the extra blood work or all of those things. And so you can, if you're able to, which I know is a huge privilege, and being able to get into those providers who would then be able to fight for you with you. But
Right.
yes, it's a huge, huge problem.
Yeah. And I just to sort of tie up this conversation, I just want to mention about OBGYNs, gynecologists, as they're called in other countries, that very often we think, well, this is a doctor who deals with female
Right.
issues, with women's health issues. They're going to be the right place. Like, I'm not going to go to my family doctor, but I am going to go to my OBGYN. But very often they don't have the information either.
Yeah, a lot of them are trained, especially OBGYNs are trained to really focus on birth and postpartum, which is fine and good, but they don't have all that cycle knowledge. And
Yeah,
I hope that they continue to be able to get this information. A
yeah,
lot of them that I've talked to before have been like, oh yeah, like cycle charting or things like that were like a 2-minute conversation when I was in very early med school. And
med
like
school.
that's right. So like that's there, it's not on the forefront of their brain that they're
Yeah.
doing every day. I've
And
found
it's
that
so
like natural,
ridiculous because they
yeah.
are the women's health doctors. It seems so
I know,
ridiculous
it's so
that all
frustrating.
they deal with is pregnancy, birth, and postpartum.
Yeah. I found that like naturopathic or integrative medicine doctors are sometimes a little bit more willing or have the knowledge base to be like, okay, like let's look at some of those root causes of what else might be going on,
Yeah.
and find those. Yeah.
Okay. I want to talk about tracking, about fertility awareness, because that's really sort of the work that you do.
Yeah.
Um, and about this concept called body literacy, which is a term that I absolutely love, but a lot of people don't even know what that is. So tell me sort of what this thing is about fertility awareness, what this thing is about body literacy, and how and why women need this information and how they use this information.
Yeah, so I really focus on the fact that there's multiple what's called fertility awareness based methods. And so this means that you're looking at your daily fertility signs, which sounds like a big thought process, but it really
Yeah,
means that our body shows different things throughout our cycle that shows us that we're fertile or we're not fertile on that particular day. So it's helpful to remember that we're not fertile for the whole cycle, meaning we can't get pregnant for the whole cycle, that it's only before ovulation and up through ovulation that we're going to be able to be
yeah.
um,
I think so
potentially
many
pregnant.
people don't know that. Like so
Yeah.
many people think that that's not saying we should that you should have unprotected sex the whole month, but
Yes.
I think we need to like clarify,
Yes. Yes.
unprotected sex is not what we are advocating here. We just want you to be aware of what is actually going on in your body and what is happening over those every single day of that cycle from day one of your period to day one of the next period.
Yeah. And so our body produces cervical mucus, which is often a lot of people refer to it as discharge. Our body has different hormone levels that you can test through things like urine testing. And then our body also, before ovulation, our resting temperature, which is called basal body temperature, is going to be lower than after ovulation. Usually, it raises it's about like half a degree Fahrenheit. I forget what that is in Celsius. I'm sorry. There shows my US living. And so with that, with those different things, so looking at cervical mucus, looking at hormone levels, and looking at basal body temperature, we can get daily information about what's going on. And therefore, in a particular cycle, figure out when in a cycle are that fertile window is going to open and when it's going to close. And so for many people, that looks like after menstruation, a few days after menstruation, our body's kind of gearing up with this estrogen. We're producing cervical mucus. So we're going to open the fertile window. We're going to assume that there's a pregnancy possibility. We also take into account that sperm can live up to 5 days with fertile mucus. So you're not just looking for that one day of ovulation that you can get pregnant, but also that our bodies are super cool and can keep sperm around for 5 days. And so they might hold on until ovulation. And then after ovulation, our temperature rises. We see this change in the cervical mucus pattern. It goes back to a more dry experience. And that's when we can be quite certain that ovulation has passed. And then from then, once you know that ovulation has passed by multiple biomarkers, then you know that for the rest of the cycle, you can't get pregnant until you start again. But the really important thing, like you mentioned, is to not just assume that you're past ovulation and that you're gonna be infertile, to really get to know your body and see that well.
Yeah. So we're talking about this, and I want to just stress this is not just about getting pregnant because I don't want
Yes,
the
yes,
assumption,
absolutely.
because this was actually something that came up in the very first episode I did of this podcast was with my daughters. And one of the things that came up, which I think is quite generic for, globally, that a lot of, sixth grade, seventh grade, they have this sort of, talk about, body changing, and boys have their talk and girls have their talk, and they have it with a nurse. And my daughters mentioned that the conversation was not only it was about periods and cycles, but was also about pregnancy. Either
Yeah,
how not to get pregnant, or the relationship about your periods and pregnancy, or, if you're in a community where family family life is very strong, then about how you want to build, get married, have a family, have lots of children. So
right.
there were like all these conversations, but at no point in time was it connected just to what it is to be a woman,
Yes,
without the relationship
yes,
of and having a baby or not having a baby, or protecting
yes,
yourself not to get pregnant. So I want to just make this distinction, that fertility awareness is not just about how do I get pregnant.
yeah,
Fertility awareness is sort of, I want to tap into this word of body literacy, and just
yes,
really learning about your body, because as our bodies change, these cycles, these signs are going to change as we navigate through, our fertility years into perimenopause, menopause. These things become really, really critical so that we know what is going on in our body. And I just want it to be that it's not, fertility awareness sounds like it's all about how do I get pregnant or how do I
yes,
avoid getting pregnant.
yes,
So I want you to talk about that a second, but just for clarity, when we are doing fertility awareness, really connecting to our body, paying attention in that sort of menstrual cycle, roughly how many days are you highly fertile for
mm,
on average? I know we're just talking about averages here,
yeah,
but
yeah.
what are we looking at?
That's a great question. And there's a little bit of a question about what that looks like. Realistically, you're fertile for like 5 to 7 days. But when you're using a particular method, that sometimes can be a little bit longer to account for
Mm,
just like efficiency of it, that
right.
the window that you're using is going to be a little bit longer. But like realistically, I mean, realistically, you're only fertile for one day in the sense of ovulation. Like that's the only day you can get pregnant, but
Yeah.
that taking into account the lifespan of sperm, that can
Um,
kind of stretch it out a little bit.
yeah. I
So
think
yeah,
that's a
that
really
would go a little
important
shorter.
point. The teacher I learned yoga for women's health with always sort of said that you could have sex on one day in one country, then travel for work 2 days later and get pregnant in another
Yes.
country two
Yes.
days later, because it's not about when you actually have sex, it's about the ovulation and the lifespan of the sperm.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. For sure, which is really important.
Okay, so talk to me about this concept of body literacy. What does that
Yeah.
mean to you? What are you advocating here? What are you sort of, how do you work with your clients around this concept?
Yeah, so I think for like you mentioned, like a huge part of this knowledge base is just understanding how our cycles work and what our reproductive system does in the sense of just like knowing our body well. So in my mind, body literacy is like this self-awareness, the self-knowledge of our menstrual cycles being a really important, like a vital sign of our life. To just know that we have this overall health knowledge and to see what's happening in that. So we talked a lot about the in the beginning about like what are some things that could be happening that's kind of on that like red flag list, and being able to know your body well allows you to really know when some things changes and when things might be something that you want some support in. So that's like on the super basic level, that's that. And so what that looks like in practicality is just understanding your body well. So understanding
Yeah,
what could be happening and then really getting to know your own body. And that looks like physically knowing your own body, emotionally knowing your own body within that, and being able to really dive into what about your menstrual cycle, what about your reproductive system is who you are, and that's
yeah,
different based on the individual.
yeah. And also different at different stages of your life cycle.
Oh, for sure, absolutely, yes.
So maybe talk to me a little bit about how things change and why we really need to have this language and awareness and connection. And then I want to ask you about how you've actually seen it practically with your clients. What has that actually done? How has it actually impacted on a real practical level your clients? But firstly, talk to me about how it changes over time and why it's so important, especially, as we're getting towards perimenopause and menopause, why this information is so important for us.
Yeah. So as we talked about in the beginning, it takes a while for our cycles to regulate. So having that knowledge early on, I think one of the most basic benefits of having this knowledge around your body and understanding when your cycles are taking place is that you know when your next period's going to come, and you can use that to make sure you have period products in resource, right? So like that's
Right.
at the most basic level, you'll
Basic
make sure
level.
that you're not wearing white pants and that you have some period products on
Right.
hand, right? But that if that's the most comfortable option for you. And then as we get into our like prime fertile years, we see most women see pretty consistent cycles. They see a lot of people see like an increase in cervical mucus production with those higher estrogen levels. They see a pretty consistent level with that. Then a lot of people wind up getting pregnant at some point and having some kids, and postpartum for a lot of people looks very different. So some
Right.
people's cycles return very quickly after giving birth, and some people's cycles take a long time to return. That does sometimes be influenced by if they're breastfeeding or not, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it is the case. So if you are breastfeeding, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're not going to be cycling. And
Yeah.
especially postpartum, it's helpful to remember that we ovulate before we'll ever bleed again. So to know that if you're, I, I, I don't want to keep harping on the
Yeah.
like not trying to get pregnant, but I think that's helpful to remember that like you can get pregnant without
Yeah,
ever
I think
bleed
I
and
think
see your
that I
cycle
think
return.
sometimes, yeah, I think sometimes women get pregnant and they're like, but I was breastfeeding and I
Yes.
didn't, and all of a sudden they've got like a surprise new addition to the family, and they're like,
Yes.
but I was breastfeeding. And as you said, I think this is such a critical point. You ovulate before you bleed. So
Yes.
you can get pregnant without realizing you're ovulating because the bleed is the we always think the bleed is the beginning of the cycle.
Yes, but it's really like
It's
the end.
the
Yeah,
end, yeah, because you have to ovulate to have the bleed, and the ovulation is
exactly.
obviously what leads to, pregnancy. But I think that's a really, really important point. So yeah,
Yeah.
breastfeeding is not foolproof, and you may be ovulating postpartum without even realizing.
Absolutely. And so for some people, like I said, their cycles return quickly. Others it can be literal years. And then with that, after we get through those childbearing years and we choose to stop having cycles or stop having children, our cycles usually if we're still in those we'll call them like prime fertile years, but before we hit perimenopause, our cycles are still going to be in that regular length.
Yeah,
And then once we start hitting perimenopause, which for depending upon the research, people have different age, and I'm sure,
yeah,
Jacqueline, you have a specific opinion about what that looks like. But
yeah,
I think I've recently been talking to a lot of women who are in their late 30s who have been told that the symptoms that they're experiencing are perimenopause. And depending upon what's actually going on, it might not be. It might just
yeah,
be some other things happening in their life, other stressors, all of those
yeah,
things. But typically we look at after age 40, we
yeah,
kind of start assuming that there could be some signs of
yeah,
perimenopause. Closer to 45 is when we're like, okay, like we're getting into those years.
yeah,
And then with cycles in perimenopause, they're going to be a little bit more unpredictable. And that's unfortunately the case. Usually the hugest tip off is that somebody has a much shorter cycle than they've ever experienced before. And those cycles in perimenopause are going to be short or long, and
yeah,
that's okay. Like that's normal that they're going to be different lengths depending upon people's beliefs, looking into other things like hormone replacement therapy, that could be an option to kind of just help your body function well. Um, and then menarche is, or I'm sorry, menopause is really that time when your body has stopped
yeah,
cycling overall. And so the like marker for in the medical world is that you haven't had a period, a bleed for a year.
yeah,
So that's kind of what that looks like overall.
yeah. Let me ask you, because I know a lot of women are like, okay, I'm done with my periods. For some women, it can be quite sad. There's a grief,
Yeah.
there's a loss. That stage of their lives are over. For some women, it's like, finally, where, done with all
Yeah.
of that I've had to deal with for 35 years. Um, but we still are female beings. Our bodies are
Yes.
still, living. We may not have a bleed anymore, but do we still have, if we've, been doing all the things that you are advising us to do, and then all of a sudden that very visible sign stops, how do we continue to connect to our body? Are there still markers? Is there still a connection through our reproductive system, even though our ovaries now are not, ovulating, we're not producing the same estrogen? How do you relate to sort of that whole connection that you've built up for such a long time as you enter postmenopause?
Yeah, so I know a lot of women who are in that stage kind of go into the moon phases and like kind of feel
Yes.
like that's a good cyclical nature aspect that they
Yeah.
can kind of base their that same rhythm off of.
Yeah.
And whether or not that's like a strong belief system for you, you can still use this knowledge, right? You can still be like, okay, like around the full moon, we're feeling a little bit more whatever and have that be a cyclical nature because we as women are cyclical beings. We have these changing rhythms over and over again, and just
Yeah.
that doesn't go away fully after menopause.
Yeah.
So yeah, just I think that's one of the ones that I see the most is that people kind of dive into that.
Yeah. Okay. I'm going to ask you a bit of a controversial question. It's the controversial question I ask all people when we talk about these types of things, and that is the oral contraceptive pill. Because
Yes.
everything you're talking about now is great and wonderful, and it resonates, and I'm 100%, behind you. But the reality is that so many young girls, women are on the oral
Yes.
contraceptive pill as their form of contraception. They come off it to get pregnant, and oops, don't you know it? They don't get pregnant straight away, or they get pregnant straight away, and then as soon as they, are postpartum, they go straight back on it. What's your relationship advice, guidance, worldview around this concept? I will preempt you because I don't want to, put you on any type of spot before, that you don't feel comfortable. But I think that the oral contraceptive pill is being given out by so many doctors like candy, especially to teens to help regulate their cycles. Any whiff of PCOS, they're putting them on the pill. Any whiff of really bad PMS, really bad, heavy bleeds, well, let's just put you on the pill. And, that's obviously happening. And I think it's not great at all. And, it is the most easily accessible and easy form of contraception to take. But I don't think actually it's doing a great service to women in general. So
Yeah.
that's my viewpoint. Let me hear
Yeah.
what you're thinking about all of this.
I think we have a very similar viewpoint. I think the thing to really help listeners understand well, if they haven't heard this before, is that most oral contraceptive pills, most hormonal birth control, the mode of action, meaning what it's supposed to do, is to shut down ovulation. And for a variety of reasons, for medical reasons, sometimes that's necessary for certain people in certain
Yes,
life situations.
yes,
And so I don't want
yes.
to disregard that it's like a
Agree.
a helpful medical tool. Like I don't think my personal belief is like don't get rid of it entirely. Like I think it's
Yeah,
helpful. And also I think it's being used harmfully in our
yeah,
society as a whole
yeah.
because like you said, it's just being given out like candy. It's just being I had one of my first times that I went to a GYN. She I had brought it like I had been like I have painful periods and she like had her prescription pad out before we even talked and she was trying to write me a prescription for some pain medication but she wrote out prescription handed it to me and then asked me more questions about oh, like, are you going to try to get pregnant soon? And I was like, yeah, I mean, like, we're open to possibly getting pregnant. And she was like, oh, never mind. Like, don't take that. And I was like, okay, like, this is the
This is
concept
more.
of like, right? Like, so, but going back more specifically into this, I think for a lot of young girls, the idea of being able to regulate your cycle and have some predictability sounds fabulous. And also, it's really doing a detriment to your
Yeah,
cycle health by shutting down ovulation and just having these fake bleeds, these breakthrough withdrawal bleeds
yeah.
that are taking place. Originally, hormonal contraception, the pill was designed without any bleeds, like there just wasn't any bleeding taking place, and they decided to add in these
Those
days
four
without it.
days, yeah, 4 or 5
Yeah,
days,
so
yeah,
that women weren't like so because the women didn't want to take it when they weren't bleeding because they thought like something was wrong. And so I think
yeah,
that history behind it is really helpful to know. And I'll give a shout out to the documentary, I think it's a documentary series, the business of birth control, because it
yes,
gives
yes,
you a
yes,
lot of information about the history of it. So if people are like,
yeah. I
oh, this
talk
is
about that
interesting,
documentary.
yeah,
Yeah.
that's a great place to start of
I,
just a
I
knowledge
also
base around
think
it.
I also think as we're talking about what women in general, at all ages
Yeah,
know and don't know, I don't think women, even grown up women, grown ups, I don't think
yeah,
they realize that the bleed on the contraceptive pill is not a real bleed. They're like, oh, I'm having a
absolutely.
period. I'm just not getting pregnant, but I'm having a period. They don't actually know what hormonally, biologically is going on in their body when they're taking the pill. They don't
Absolutely.
realize that it is a withdrawal bleed, especially, yeah, as you correctly said, they added those sort of 4 or 5 day placebo pills in the packet. So it looks like a monthly thing. So you're taking it every day. What I heard was that they added those pills because if when the doctors were telling the women to stop taking the pill so they would have their bleed, they would then forget to go back on them.
Yes, yes,
So,
yes, yes, yes.
so they sort of built it into the packet that
Yeah,
you've got those placebo pills built into the packet, so the women don't stop taking it, have the breakthrough bleeding, and then have to remember to restart on day 4, 5, or 6, whatever day it may
absolutely.
be.
Yeah.
Um, so yes, so I don't think women really understand the biology of what's going on. Yeah, that documentary, The Business of Birth Control, is fantastic for anyone who is wants to learn more, is questioning, wants to really understand what they are taking. Um, and that, as you correctly said, and I don't think they realize it either, it's actually shutting down the
Right.
natural hormonal reproductive responses.
Right.
Um, which is why when you come off it, you don't know what's going
Right.
to happen. You don't know
Exactly.
how your body is going to take to come back to its
And
natural
I
rhythm.
do think that's a huge problem of teens get put on hormonal birth control and then they go through college and that, which is totally like if people are making informed consent around that, I don't have an
Yes,
issue with that knowledge
agreed,
base.
agreed.
And then also they come off, they've gotten married, they're ready to have kids, they come off of it and they're expecting to get pregnant right away because that's what we've been told, right? Like you have to go
Yep,
on these contraceptives so that you don't get pregnant. And then our cycles haven't regulated. They haven't had this time to figure out what's going on and also is recovering from these years of ovulation being shut down. And
yep,
so our bodies take some time to get back into that. And my particular hot take in this current season is also that therefore the medical system is switching really quickly to then going towards artificial resources for pregnancy. So IVF, things like that, because women are coming off of hormonal birth control and they're not yet cycling well and
yep,
regularly. And so they go straight into these other medical things. Again, there's a time and a place for things like that, but that's it kind of goes from one extreme to another, and
to
our
the other.
bodies are being controlled by the medical
Yep,
system when we don't have the knowledge base of it.
yep.
So, yeah.
And another thing we're seeing at the moment, just to put another nail in the coffin of
Yeah.
the conversation with about oral contraceptive pills, is now with the increased awareness of hormone replacement treatment, hormone replacement
Yes.
therapy, the fact that now it is deemed as safe, which is great. Women are now going straight from oral contraceptive pills and then going to their doctors in sort of early mid perimenopause with symptoms. And the doctors are like, well, great, let's just put you straight on HRT. And they're moving from one hormonal product straight to another hormonal product without catching a breath, without
Yeah,
letting their body ever recalibrate itself. And again, we're not against pill use when it is informed and
for sure.
appropriate. We are not against HRT use when it is informed and appropriate. I think we both agree we are very much against women not being connected to their bodies and never having the opportunity to really take time to listen to what their bodies are telling them, to what the natural hormonal feminine cycles that have now been totally eradicated because you've gone from one product straight to the next product without catching a breath.
Absolutely. 100%.
Okay, good. I'm pleased that we're in agreement. Okay. Um, I want to ask you about the role of stress.
Yeah.
I know we could probably have a whole podcast about this topic and the way that stress impacts women's cycles, their hormones, what's happening. Maybe just talk briefly about the role of stress because I think it's an important addition to the conversation.
Mhm.
Um, and yeah,
Yeah.
where are you holding here?
So
What are your thoughts
the
here?
first thing that comes to mind is that it's if you haven't thought about this before as a listener, when our body is in a state of stress, our reproductive system's going to be the first thing to go. And
Yeah,
stress can be a whole bunch of things. So we can
yeah,
think of stress as like that physical, emotional reaction to stuff, but it can also be, you had mentioned way early on, which I meant to go back to, when like teens are doing a lot of sports or something and under eating and over exercising, like that
yeah,
puts our body in a stressed state.
yes,
So our cortisol levels are higher, and our reproductive systems, the reproductive hormones are going to be the first things to go. Our
Yeah.
body is not going to be thinking about like how can we best ovulate when we're trying to stay alive and survive. And so therefore cycles will be different during those times. And for many people that means they're not cycling for a long period
Yeah.
of time. For some people, that just means cycles will be delayed or a little bit different in regards to the lengths or the types of cycles
Yeah.
that they're having. And also it can exacerbate other things that are going on. So if you do have PCOS or endometriosis, times of stress are also going to increase some of those symptoms, or in general, just like increase some of those other symptoms. If your body's in a stress state and not being able to rest enough, estrogen levels are going to be higher, things like that, right? Like, so
Yeah.
we're in this, if we're in this constant state of stress versus just like one stressful event specifically,
Yeah.
our bodies are really going to react in a variety of ways, but the biggest thing is it's just going to be significantly different, and
Yeah.
that the details of that are going to be dependent upon the person, but yeah.
Yeah. And I think just to note that, as you said, it's not just stress today. Like you've got exams or you've got a
Yes.
deadline or whatever. Stress can show up in lots of many ways. If you have chronic stress, that is going to impact your reproductive system in lots of different ways. And it's not just, for this next month or the next 2 months. It can be, impactful in many, many ways. And I just not to scare women, but just to let them know that if you're going to the doctor because you're having challenges, if the doctor isn't asking you what's going on with your stress, you should probably go find another doctor. Maybe
Yeah.
that's a bit radical, but
Yeah, no,
yeah.
I think it is, because I think the biggest thing is like maybe the question isn't stress, but like what's going on with your
Oh,
life, or what other big changes are happening, or what little changes have happened. Like, did you did you like move to a different room in your house, right? And like are sleeping in a different location, or like all of those
yeah,
things, like, or did the seasons changed and you went from having air conditioning on, and or maybe the other way around. Maybe like you have heat in your house and then you don't have air conditioning. And so your
yeah,
body's really like much more hot during those seasons, and it's feeling those different feels of all of
yeah.
that. And our body goes through these states of stress without even realizing it sometimes.
Realizing it. Yeah,
So yeah,
yeah, yeah,
for sure. Eating well is another thing that people sometimes forget can super influence how their cycles are
yeah.
reacting.
Amazing. I could carry on talking to you for ages because there's so many different
Yes.
topics that we could hit on. But as we come to the end of our conversation, is there anything that we haven't yet talked about? Anything that we haven't yet you haven't yet shared that is really you want to make sure that we add to this conversation? Maybe about sort of community around women and not feeling so alone. And again, sort of going back to that thing that you can go to the doctor, not really get the answers that you need, and then are like, well, I don't know what to do next. Sort of, is there anything around community or anything else that you really want to share?
Yeah, so I do think I know you're having these conversations on your podcast and in your work, but I think so many of us are in life circles that we're not having conversations around our menstrual cycle on a regular
Yeah,
basis. And it's because of this like shame or stigma
yeah,
or thing that's around it. And I would challenge people to be willing to just have these conversations with the circles of friends, family that they're around. My biggest thing is just being able to have these conversations within your family unit and being
yeah,
able to just make it normalized. So, like I was talking to somebody else about this recently this week about how like my kids, they're 4 and 6, but they just know that like when I'm menstruating and all of these things, just because like it just is like they just
yeah,
know, they have always known. Also,
yeah,
like my kids when they were 2, 1, like just followed me into the bathroom, so they like knew what was going on, right?
yeah,
But that aspect of just being able to have these conversations and just not make it a big deal. And I think that sometimes we're always on the like, oh, I'm on my period. Like it's just a horrible
yes,
experience.
yes,
And we can really talk about the benefits of it too. So bring in some of those like joy times in that as
yeah,
well.
yeah. And I've been looking at the poster behind you, our whole conversation, the one with the different stages of what's going on in
Yeah, here.
your, yeah, this one. And like, I love that. That's such a familiar graphic for me. And I'm sure that there are people who have no idea what that graphic represents. But
Yeah.
I think every woman needs to have that graphic in her house and have the conversation with their daughters around that graphic, because it just shows so clearly what is going on in your body at all the different stages, all the
Yes.
different levels. And you also have a moon cycle there also. Is the top line a moon
This
cycle there?
this
No,
one?
in the graphic of
Oh, this
itself.
is Oh, the top is what your follicles are doing, so it
Okay,
changes into the corpus
okay.
luteum. Yeah.
So
So this
I've
is for
seen that. Yeah, I've seen that graphic
yeah,
also with the moon phases.
yes, for sure. So this is from learnbodyliteracy.com. They have a book, and so feel free to find it yourself and print it out too.
Yeah, yeah, amazing. Okay, so as we end our conversation, this is the question I ask all my guests. This podcast is called "The Things I Want My Daughters to Know." And I really ask you, what do you want your daughters, real or figuratively, goddaughters, nieces, that next generation of girls coming up? What do you want them to know? If you could just shout from the rooftops that one message.
Yeah, I think we've talked about so many things today that I would say would be a priority, but I think the thing that I want my daughter to know is just how powerful her body is and how much of a
Mm,
like wonder the cycles are. And even though there's seasons of life where it feels very annoying, that there's a lot of power and understanding with that. And just to keep advocating for anything that she needs help with regards to her
yeah,
cyclical life.
yeah. Amazing. This is such a strong, powerful conversation. I've loved really every minute of it. I think we need more people like you talking about this. We already have had some conversations on the podcast about this, but I think we can't have too many because it's just
Absolutely.
not talked about. So, Emma, where can people find you if they want to follow you, connect with you, learn more about your work? Where are you hanging out?
Yeah, so I love to hang out on Instagram. My handle's Cyclical Doula. I also have my podcast, the Cyclical Doula Podcast, but I am on most social medias, and you can find me online as well.
Amazing. We didn't even talk about the miscarriage part, which I think is another
Yeah,
conversation that is not
absolutely.
talked about enough. So we will get you back on, Emma, to talk about that other side of work, because I think we need to really, you know, peel back the layers of a conversation that people do not like to talk about. So
Yes, for
thank
sure.
you, Emma. This has been amazing. I'm so happy that you joined us today. And thank you, everyone, for listening. Please reach out to Emma. Have this conversation with your daughters. Listen to this episode with your daughters. Emma has shared so much important information that sometimes just hearing it from someone else resonates rather than you, sitting down with your daughter, you're like, Mom, I don't want to talk about that. But if you hear it from someone else, sometimes it's easier. So thank you, Emma. Thank you, everyone, for joining us and for listening. And I look forward to sharing another episode with you on the Things I Want My Daughters to Know podcast very soon.
Thank you.